The Proleptic Journal of a Shite-Extractor Tractor Man by Scott Waller. 11. Around 2 weeks later. My new manager turns out to have a human side after all. He was quite subdued today. Manu made a silly blunder of the kind that you can't get away with hiding, so he had to tell the manager. The manager just waved him away, saying that he was to fix and report. That is, Manu had to follow the standard programmed rectification procedure. The manager gave his vocal assent to initiate this program without hesitation, noted the source of the error, i.e. Manu, and told him to leave without sanctioning him, without even yelling at him. Damned if I understand anything. Manu says the manager is undergoing a lot of stress. It's funny how stress can be contagious. I find myself having the same symptoms as the manager without getting his advantages, needless to say. But I suppose I'm also capable of sympathizing with him a bit. Just before Manu and I left for the day, he opened up to us in a familiar, almost friendly way. Manu, who has worked with him previously, said that he'd never seen him like that before. Manu and I kept exchanging bemused looks as he chatted away with us in this oddly laid-back way. He is obviously a man deeply concerned with his working mission. It is this sense of mission that spurs him on, more than the performance-enhancing medication treatment that all managers undergo. He is quite the model of professional dedication. I suppose you have to respect him for that. He deeply admires his own boss, the chief executive owner, the boss of us all in our company. He is always singing his praises. He appreciates what he called his cutting-edge intuition, or hard-edged genius, or thorough decisiveness, or his superhuman leadership efficiency. All this, even though he's actually under close medical supervision. The manager explained in a sorrowful tone how much of the CE owner's earnings go into his own medication and performance enhancement. He runs the company stuck in some sort of medical apparatus, dependent on the best medical services in order to thrive in his function. This came as a huge revelation to Manu and me. Naturally, we have never seen the chief executive owner of Cheerily. What lower stratum ever does get to see an upper stratum of the highest caliber in the flesh? I don't think I've even seen him on the slipnet. CE owners tend to keep a very low profile, even for upper strata, who are pretty discreet by nature, except for some eligibles. So hearing about the CE owner's state of health was a surprise to me and caused me some worry, not only for him, but also for the company. "The poor man," said the boss. "Only 90 years old. It must be tough dealing with the pressures of owning managing." He spoke about one of his colleagues who had the privilege of working in the CE owner's presence and is able to see his brilliance in action on a daily basis. Apparently, the CE owner can think harder and faster and more insightfully at a level of 100 times greater than the average middle stratum. God knows what the ratio must be compared to a lower stratum. It's because of such rare abilities that he is the big boss after all, and that he earns God knows how much more than a middle stratum. I had never imagined that I would one day meet someone who knows someone who works so closely with the chief executive owner. Judging by my boss's description of this med-dependent CE owner, I imagine him to be a bedridden, gaunt skeleton, his skin ghostly pale and all rumpled up because there is too much skin for his body that is so focused on solving huge and complex problems. A sort of brilliant ethereal mental presence, like the Sibyl who was given the divine gift of foresight, but was not allowed to die, and so continued to age, shrivel and decay for eternity. CE owners are incredibly important to society, but that doesn't make them vain or arrogant, hence their taste for keeping a low public profile. I believe that in the past, perhaps in your day. There used to be a distinction between the chief executives who ran the companies and the owners who owned it. Over time, that distinction faded away. The Guild of Chief Executives were confided more and more responsibilities and found it progressively more difficult not to own the companies they ran. Their guild comprised of a network of top managers appointing each other to similar jobs in other companies. Eventually, this closed-shop practice made it impossible for the companies to function without them. After the manager finished his chat with Manu and me, I began asking around about this mysterious chief executive owner. Word is that he has loads of electronic components attached to him, and tubes coming out of every orifice of his body and out of other holes that surgeons have incised in him all over. Presumably, those tubes function along the same lines as our strap-in seats, only more taxing, sucking out his extraordinary human cerebral and bodily faculties in order to keep Cheerily running successfully. Our CE owner is the vital source of such energy for the whole enterprise, the motor of the collective engine, the pulse of a living corporate entity, and yet he is apparently unable to get up and move around. That's because of all the mental physical sacrifices he makes for the company. I learned that he no longer has any real pleasures in life outside work, except for watching the financial news and indulging in the occasional 3D neuroporn, which torments him by reminding him what he cannot truly enjoy due to his incapacitation. He dreams of running about freely, of talking to ordinary people in the street, but he knows that it's impossible, since he is both clinically immobile and imprisoned by his immense duty. It's also said that while spending all his time and energy running the company, the poor man has suffered years of neglect, streamlining after streamlining, downsizing after downsizing, and it's all gone to his head. So he's practically forgotten how to feed himself. He has completely neglected his bodily health, and is paying the price for it now. Like many other CE owners, Howes is unable to think long-term about himself, which is why he has neglected his health, because of the terrible weight of day-to-day pressures. This neglect is a niche hangover from decades ago when society as a whole sacrificed the long-term on the altar of present want. He was only following the trend at the time, but now he has to suffer personally for all the sacrifices he has made. While I was listening to people at work talking about the plight of the chief executive owner of Cheerily, I felt sorry for him. But after a while it cheered me up in a strange kind of way, for I realized that my life wasn't so bad, and that things were much worse for people with big responsibilities than they are for people who lead a simple life. If I'm unsatisfied with my lot in life on occasions, I realize that it could be worse. I could be a struggling CE owner. Not that I would ever be capable of dealing with such big responsibilities. You have to be born to it. Some people's arses fit nicely into the hot seat of governance. Other people squeeze their fat buttocks into a dummy's strap-in chair. Yep, yours truly. But I mustn't grumble. I have a relaxing life, all in all. I think less and less about Faye as each day goes by. Obviously, I work to survive, for the little luxuries, to save for my pez, etc. But I can get some comfort from knowing that in the process I am also helping a brilliant individual like our big boss to thrive. The same CE owner who is in turn giving so much of himself to the company. Maybe I'm lucky after all. Around 2 weeks later. A lot of rumours flying about at work. The company is in a shake-up procedure. My boss is running about like a headless chicken. He's gone back to being stressful, and he's piling on the pressure. But since he revealed his human side to us, I see him differently. I'm even getting used to his anger fits, and I understand that it doesn't come from him. He's just a vehicle. He has his problems, and there's greater pressure on him than there is on us. He's a nice man at heart, although Manu is not as convinced as me on that point. So much the worse for him. That attitude will get him demoted sooner than me, if the hierarchy notices his negativity. And if it ever comes to a me or him scenario, I'll make sure they notice. Not that I'll seek out his downfall. I don't wish him ill, but given my poor performance of late, it would be unwise for me not to make sure that I seem enthusiastic about my job. It's always better to be on the safe side, just in case. Around a week later. Good news! The rumours had been going around for some time, but today it was confirmed. My manager is being promoted, and he's asked me to accompany him in a small team as one of the collaborators when he takes on his new position. We start next week. I was worried that Manu might be a bit jealous, especially if some of the words that I uttered to management in one of the standard neurofeedback sessions influenced the decision to choose me over Manu. But he wasn't miffed, or pretended not to be. He said that it's a promotion for our boss, but it's a transfer for those who trail him. I didn't argue the point. We'll probably be in touch mode on the slipnet. Around 3 weeks later. I've been more than a little busy of late because of my boss's promotion. It must be exciting for him. He often has direct dealings with the chief executive owner. It makes me feel very important just having that indirect contact through my boss with Shin Lee's big boss. That said, it can't be easy for him. The company's going through changes, and I have to be strapped in my new pod all day, as do most employees. They need as much energy as possible to ride the storm. And we all feel half dead at weekends. And we all feel half dead at weekends. And we all feel half dead at the weekends. I don't have much to say. I'm off to bed. I've almost stopped thinking about Faye and the outcasts. I've almost stopped thinking about Faye and the outcasts these days. I've almost stopped thinking about Faye and the outcasts these days. From a fairy-like waif flitting about in corridors, she has become a faint ghost floating about in the depths of memory. Around a week later. Business as usual in my new position, and a lot of business at that. I don't have much of interest to send back into the past today. I need to rest. It's been ages since I can even think of giving Dolly a seeing to. I fell asleep while she was going down on me the other day. Maybe it's time to replace her. That will cost a fortune, but a part exchange deal might be worth it. When I get my energy levels back, I'll get properly counselled for my sex life. But for now it suits me to be running on low batteries. 4 days later. Same as usual. Nothing to report, except the fact that there is nothing to report. But do I need to report that in the first place? The fact that I report nothing already means that there is nothing worthy of report, you might say. Well, maybe. But reporting that there is nothing to report at least informs you that there is nothing worthy of reporting going on in my humdrum existence. After all, it could be that there was something worth reporting that I'd forgotten to report. Then again, I suppose you could argue that I would have remembered it if it was really that important. For God's sakes, Norby, stop blabbing. There was one thing I was going to speak right about before I got tangled in my own thought threads. What was it? Oh yeah, I was going to say that they've upped the energy intake even more on the strap-in chairs, but that will be over soon, I suppose. Around a week later. Things got strange today. At the beginning of my shift I went to get myself strapped in as usual. The screen showed that there was a regular intake of my energy into the machine, and I was ready to have my morning semi-nap. But I didn't feel tired. I shut my eyes, but something peculiar was going on with the sleep prompter program. I realized this because I felt a particularly tenacious itch on my nose. Now this is very unusual, because the strap-ins have a numbing effect on your real face. This helps the pod activate your virtual neurological face. It so happened that, without thinking, because my right hand had been fiddling with the sleep mode controls, I used my left arm to scratch my nose. It was then that I noticed that my left arm wasn't properly strapped in. I looked at the other straps, and they too were not strapped into my body. Of course I had my arms in correctly, but the pod's automatic skin cling action had not done its part. There is a little button you can press to start the strap-in process again. I pressed it, but it didn't work properly either. I simply couldn't get myself strapped in, and yet the screen seemed to think that I already was. How very unusual, I said to myself. This kind of thing has happened so rarely in my professional life that I could barely believe it was happening. Occasionally, like when systems are being replaced, you get a temporary blip of this nature, but there is usually a malfunction light flashing. I remember that occurring a few times during a big systems adjustment period a few years back. Otherwise, it's almost unheard of for the strap-in guardians to get it wrong. What happened to my strap-in chair today was almost eerily atypical. I would have spoken to the guy next to me, but he was completely absorbed in having his bodily neuronal potential, well, absorbed, what with the company's current sailing in troubled waters and all that. Demand for human energy suction is fairly constant and, well, demanding. I checked some other colleagues. They too seemed to be absorbed in their perfectly functioning strap-in chairs. It was only my pod that was dysfunctional. I decided to go and try and find the boss. I could have belled him, of course, but I knew that he was on site, and I fancied stretching my legs. I wandered through the premises. Part of me didn't want to find him, for I felt free here, being the only one enjoying my full capacity, while everyone around me was out for the count. It occurred to me that that's how outcasts feel when they're plucking up the courage to drop out the system. I felt like this was my little particular taste of their rebellion, but I was probably a little excited because of the unexpected absence of energy suction. As I was wandering around, a red door that I had barely noticed before leapt into my field of vision. It was open. I should explain that at work, red doors are forbidden to us unless we've been given a special pass for exceptional reasons, and even then, we're usually under supervision. We never go near them out of habit. Even if we tried, they would most likely be locked. Only certain middle stratum employees have touch-read access to the spaces that the red doors hide. If I were to touch the lock screen of the door, it would warn me in a loud voice that I'm not allowed to enter. I learned that lesson a long time ago, when I was a trainee, and I embarrassed myself in front of a bunch of experienced employees who laughed at me as I jumped with fright at the forbidden door's harsh reprimand. But today, if I did decide to go through the red door, nobody would be there to laugh at me. Then I thought of Dennis. I hadn't seen much of him, and he had almost slipped out of my mind. I could check with him, I mused. Should I ask him to cover for me? Right in the middle of this thought, his exact words came back to me. Maybe I can open some doors for you. He meant it metaphorically, but here before my eyes, it was happening literally. Fate had opened this door before me, and I was itching with curiosity to go into the forbidden zone. I could always talk to Dennis about it later, but for now, I had to take advantage of the opportunity that lay before me. I pushed the door fully open. It was a thick metal door with a rubber seal. I had to lean against it to budge it too. It opened up onto a long hallway that sloped downwards. This passage looked as though it led in the general direction of the administrative core of the EE Distribution Center, the forbidden section of the underground basement, where lower strata rarely tread. I went down it for many minutes until I reached a winding iron stairwell. After descending I know not how many spirals, I ended up in a sort of huge warehouse-like space packed with machines and equipment that was twice or thrice my height. Amalgams of plastic, glowing lights, electronic circuits, dusty tubes, a complex web of wires, glass, metal plates, some shining, others rusted, and variegated biomass in jars, some bubbling, some evidently defunct. Parts of this equipment reached up to the ceiling and out to the walls, extending in all directions. I wove in and out the labyrinth formed by the spaces between the apparatus, getting stuck at dead ends on more than one occasion. I crept beneath some cabins with dozing, neuro-helmeted little men inside them. I found a tall cupboard and decided to remain near it, so as to be ready to dart behind it should I hear anyone come in. Then I took a good look around me. What I beheld was strange, magnificent, and detailed to the point that my eyes were overwhelmed with data. I felt excited by the privilege of witnessing it. After trying to examine the mass of shapes and colours, my attention was drawn to a fancy archway at the other end of the room. It seemed to harbour an important-looking door. To my surprise, that door was not locked either. Following the in for a penny, in for a pound principle, I went through it. On the other side there was a room containing a series of large screens displaying managers standing round a table, looking very busy. I spotted a door which probably led to the meeting room itself. As I came closer to the door, an electronic voice belonging to the entry system warned, "Important meeting in progress. Do not disturb." Thinking on my feet, and surprising myself in the process, I asked the door's entry system in a confident tone what kind of meeting it was, and whether my manager was there, making out as if I'd been sent to pass on an important message. The door replied that it was a progress update meeting, and my manager was scheduled to attend with several other managers and the chief executive owner. I could see managers speaking on the screens, but couldn't hear them on the speakers. Although there was mechanical humming filling the air, I could just about make out the sound of human voices through the ventilation above. Those voices more or less coincided with the speaking I could see on the screens. Clearly, the screens were showing in real time the meeting that was taking place in the room on the other side. They showed scenes just like some neurofictions I have seen, with a bunch of bosses buzzing about doing, well, boss-like things. Some managers were attending in the flesh, while others had a hovering screen or a wheeled screen presence. They were divided into half a dozen little discussion groups. They would talk together for some time, then leave the group they were in and go off to another group. Then they would break up again and periodically reconfigure every so often. While I was observing this, I had a thought that sent a tremor through me. I might see the chief executive owner of Cheerily with my own eyes on the screen. Maybe just one wall was separating my little humble self from the great boss of the whole company. I felt enormously special. I was so euphoric that it completely skipped my mind how much trouble I would be in if I got caught. I kept a lookout, but I still couldn't see the chief executive owner. He must have been off screen, yet he was highly likely to be there, because such a high concentration of bosses meant that a big boss would need to steer the helm in person. But I was only speculating, and I could not be certain. Still watching the managers shift around, and apparently dwindle in number, I became irritated by the constant squeak and humming sound emanating from a wall to my right. It came from somewhere behind a pile of disused screens and other equipment. I looked through a gap between this equipment. It turned out the noise was caused by the wheels of a conveyor belt. It turned out that the noise was caused by the wheels of a conveyor belt, which originated somewhere behind me in another room, led through the side of the room I was in, and, most probably, went into the meeting room. I slipped between two huge old screens and, I hoped, out of potential camera view. I could now get a clear glimpse at the conveyor belt. It was sending in what looked like medicine and other small objects through a small opening into the meeting room. It must be for the chief executive owner, I thought, remembering what our manager had said about him a while back. The conveyor belt's opening to the meeting room was covered with a flap that allowed me a brief glimpse inside each time the presence of one of the transparent perspex boxes, which contained syrups and pills and various products and instruments, sent an automatic signal to the electronic arm to lift the flap up so that the boxes could make their way to the other side. I stood there trembling, not knowing whether or not I ought to lift up the flap myself, so as to try and see inside the meeting room, in which someone like me could hardly ever hope to be invited, and would be a seriously unwelcome gatecrasher if discovered. Once again my aching curiosity got the better of me. I reached out to the rubber covering, lifted it up, and savoured the sight of a forbidden spectacle. To be honest, I was a tad disappointed. I could neither see the chief executive owner, nor any of the managers that were supposed to be there. Had the door been wrong? But what about the screens? Or had the meeting just finished? I concentrated my eyes and ears, but I could hardly see anything clearly at all, nor could I hear distinctly at first. Then, all of a sudden, I could make something out over the ambient drone and pings and bleeps of the room's machines. I could hear the voice of my manager. He seemed to be speaking in a pleading tone. There were also other voices. I did not recognize them. They were probably managers, but I could not see the buzzing managerial activity that I had seen on the screens. All I saw was a dark mound at the far end of the room. This mound was mostly covered with dark cloth, but precisely what was under the cloth remained a mystery. I heard my manager pleading again. He sounded like his usual dignity was collapsing, and he was likely to burst into tears any minute. This was very disconcerting. When his voice ceased, it was followed by a strange, hoarse murmuring noise. Then my manager suddenly came into view. He was backing away from the mound. I was petrified and made to close the flap, but then I thought that if he happened to catch sight of the flap closing, his suspicions would be aroused. So I tried to remain still, but my original instinct made me begin to close the flap, which made me worry that someone might have seen the flap twitch, and then looked in my direction and seen my beady eyes gawping at them. I was apparently lucky. Nobody seemed to notice me there watching with entranced fascination as my manager fumbled about on the screen of his electronic cylinder scroll for something that was obviously important to him. Perhaps he was trying to find data, something that might exonerate him from a dreadful accusation of inefficiency. Eventually he rolled up his cyber cylinder, put it into his jacket, and went sheepishly out a door that I could hear opening and closing but could not see. There was a pause before a screen wheeled its way in from another room. Soon enough, another pleading voice could be heard. It was emanating from a screen-trapped manager. The hoarse murmuring noise, which I understood to be a voice now, interrupted this manager's plea. I was beginning to understand one or two of the words of the faceless voice when, suddenly, I heard a noise from the door. I instinctively hid for a couple of minutes behind a thick metallic pillar. It was nothing, just a clanking sound from the working of a machine. I went back to the conveyor belt hole, where I could now see two top managers, one real and one on a wheeled screen, walking and wheeling out of the room. They seemed deeply worried. One looked very upset and needed a short and manly dose of encouragement from his on-screen peer. "Come on," said the virtual consoler in a strident and clear voice. "We've got work to do." A mechanical arm folded out from the screen, gave the manager a reassuring tap on the shoulder, and folded back into the screen as they both went off. the real manager to the exit while the screen switched off its managerial occupant and joined a storage row of other screens. I waited for a short while and decided to return to my post. I wanted to be at my workstation before anyone noticed my suspiciously and inexplicably long absence. I managed to get back without being seen. I sat in my pod without saying a word to anyone. I spent the rest of the workday pretending to be strapped in as normal. The pod guardians hadn't noticed anything. Thankfully, I was able to get the helmet to do a few tasks that would help camouflage the rest of my inactivity in the pod. I told myself that if anyone asked, I would just say that I thought that the strap-in was working. If anyone had noticed me on the cameras wandering about when and where I shouldn't have been, I could always say that I had originally suspected that there had been a problem, and I went to ask someone to make sure. I couldn't find anyone, and I hadn't noticed that the door I went through was red. Besides, I thought that the door wasn't forbidden, because otherwise it wouldn't have been open. I saw that my boss was busy, so I came back, strapped myself in, and fell asleep, thinking that everything was back to normal. As I was tired, I went into real sleep, thinking I was going into half-nap mode. In short, I cobbled together some sort of excuse in my head. I was able to do a lot of thinking in that time, when my brain was supposed to be available for company use. I spent almost the whole day with my eyes shut, pretending to be involved in some program. But all the while, I was churning things over, just thinking. 1 day later. Yesternight I could barely sleep. Speak writing about the previous day did nothing to evacuate it from my thoughts. When that wasn't keeping me awake, I was thinking about my PES plan. PES issues are something I had shoved to the back of my mind since I met Faye. I sort of thought, if you don't think about it, it'll go away. Only it hasn't. I finally managed to get a bit of shut-eye in the early hours of this morning. I was convinced that there was a link between my weird experience during the day and my PES plan. Fragmentary images of the odd incidents I had witnessed in the forbidden section of the underground basement kept turning over in my mind. At the same time, I kept worrying that I've messed up my life plan by choosing the wrong PES. I just had no way of making sense of it all. So it was in a semi-anesthetized, sleepy state that I made my way to work today. And what a day I had of it. Yesterday was odd enough, definitely hitting the 90s on the weirdometer. But if I thought the weirdness of yesterday could not be matched, that's because I hadn't yet notched up the work day I had today. On my way to work, I tried to ward off the hope that my strap-in would be dysfunctional, so as to protect myself from the blows of disappointment. I kept telling myself that such a blessing doesn't happen twice in a lifetime. When I finally did get to work, to my immense surprise, the strap-in chair was dysfunctional, in exactly the same way as it had been the previous day. I couldn't believe my luck. I strapped myself in as usual and pretended to go into semi-nap mode. While my eyes were shut, my thoughts turned back to the events of yesterday. The strange room, the mound of cloth, and the faceless voice, the teeming of managers. I was dead set on getting up immediately and going on my wanders once again. Unfortunately, I dozed off because my body had to recuperate for the sleep I lost the previous night. When I woke up again, I felt refreshed, lucid, and propelled by the resolve to go exploring again. Luckily, I'd only dozed off for around 20 minutes, so I still had time to creep out. I checked to make sure I wasn't being observed. The coast was clear. This time I was more worried about being seen, for if they have it on record that I've been out of bounds 2 days in a row, none of my previous excuses, which, let's face it, were pretty lame anyway, would wash. I knew that. It worried me, no doubt about it, but, unusually for me, I just said to myself, sod it, I'm going anyway, and set off. I got to the same area adjoining the meeting room. Like yesterday, the door announced the warning about the private meeting. I returned to the spot by the conveyor belt, lifted the flap, and peeked through the hole. Again, I could make out very little. I could hear the voice of a manager. He, like my boss yesterday, was speaking in a pleading tone. He was practically whimpering, if truth be known. I heard the other mysterious and hoarse voice that belonged to the same invisible speaker, hidden no doubt somewhere behind the mound of cloth. In all probability, it belonged to the CE owner himself. The manager was now snivelling. I was determined to try and see the CE owner, so I pushed my head right into the opening. I could see the mound of dark blue cloth more clearly. It was bestrewn with patches of circuitry. There were thousands of wires and tubes coming out of it. Then I realized that all the medication that was piling up behind me must be destined for those tubes. I turned my head round to the side and saw that the conveyor belt lined the inner wall of the meeting room. It took the medicine to a set of robotic arms, which removed the packages from their transparent plastic boxes, separated out pills, colourful liquids and sachets. The robotic arms opened the pill packets, dropping the pills into different mobile trays and bottles and vials, which were then tilted so that their content could trickle into glass troughs. Various powders were being removed from their sachets and mixed in water. The mixture was then injected into tubes. All this was performed at an amazing speed. Since my head was blocking the flow of medicine, I was scared that the interruption of my supply would get me noticed, so I pushed all the accumulated medicine boxes behind me through the hatch. Soon the flow of medication was back to normal, so I had another look through the hatch. Before doing so, I gathered all the medication reachable on my side and pushed it through so as to give me more time. The unhappy, chided manager had left the room. I could hear the murmuring sound coming from high up on the mound. Although it had a strange mechanical quality about it, it was definitely a human voice. There were words that I could catch here and there, but I missed the general meaning. I contorted my body so as to look up to the top of the mound. Of course, I had to be careful not to fall on the conveyor belt. If my perky mug, atop a pile of medication, had wound up being conveyed into the next room, I really would have some explaining to do. I was just able to see a greyish round thing moving in unison with the murmuring voice. I tried to focus on this greyish ball. It was hardly possible, but I could swear that it looked like a head. Then, all of a sudden, the grotesque realization came to me. I was horrified. I couldn't believe it at first. Then I was quite sure it was true. The greyish round ball was indeed a head with grey hair. This head was looking at a series of screens and murmuring instructions to a hologram manager who was sheepishly assenting. But that was not the worst of it, for what I had taken to be a mound of cloth looked distinctly like a huge pile of flesh covered in cloth. That flesh made up the enormous body that was none other than the body of the CE owner, a lonely head on a sea of fat, bobbling like a buoy in jittery waters. Here and there it was possible to see pieces of skin showing through the folds of the cloth, particularly where the flesh was penetrated by the transparent medication tubes, through which liquids of various colours flowed. I could not believe the evidence of my eyes. The grey head yelled out what sounded like a name and number. From a trapdoor in the floor, a seated manager was slowly raised into view, jumping to his feet as he realised what was happening to him. No sooner had his gaze pointed in the direction of the gigantic mound's peak than the manager bowed his head and crouched down, virtually prostrating himself on the floor. From this position he snivelled out some speech beginning, "Oh, great Chief Executive Owner." He apologised for his inefficiency and unworthiness. It was at this point, after observing certain twitches in the cloth heap and the patches of flesh, which were moving in time with the ups and downs of the faceless voice's tone and volume, that my horrendous realization, whose truth part of me still resisted, was confirmed, namely that the mountainous body of Darvosian flesh, covered by dark blue cloth, really was a human body attached to a greyish head. I moved from the hole, disgusted at what I had witnessed. I was so stunned that I almost forgot to push through the pile of medication that had gathered up on the conveyor belt behind me and was spilling onto the floor below. Although I had trouble believing the evidence of my senses, the deductions of my mind were proving even more difficult to swallow. It gradually dawned on me that so much of what I had thought true was a bundle of lies. Well, not exactly all lies. It is true that the chief executive owner is in a terrible state. He is a pitiful man in his 90s. He probably does have tubes coming out of every natural orifice of his body, as well as others surgically created. He is unable to get up and move around. He probably doesn't have any pleasures in life, except watching the financial reports and 3D pseudo-neuroporn, or in his case, live performances, that no doubt torment him as much as they excite him. He may well dream of running about freely, but he knows that it's impossible for him, imprisoned as he is in his clinical obesity. But he certainly isn't the gaunt, ailing skeleton that my rumour-nourished imagination had painted. It's not his shriveled, ascetic skin that folds over his bones. It's his vast reams of flab that is hideously rumpled and puckered. Moreover, I reflected angrily, the tubes attached to him do not suck out his energy the way our strap-in tubes do to us. They suck up the energy of thousands of employees like me. So much of our potential for real life feeds this mammoth. The dissidents were right all along. I had never fully believed it, or had never wanted to believe it, but they were right, more literally so than even they suspected. The great societal machine siphons off our lifeblood to ease the insatiable appetite of a pathologically greedy gargantua. Thousands of us are sacrificing our precious vitality to feed the gluttony of a heinously supersated entity that barely deserves the name human, an ever-swelling, vile mound of useless blubber, reinforced with electric adjuncts. How much have I given to make the whole operation as efficient as possible for the benefit of this giant social leech in exchange for a pre-programmed lifespan? There was the connection to my Pez. It was the injustice of having to make a choice from such a limited range of options that were imposed upon me, and people like me, by a tiny minority who hoard all the lion's shares of life's options for themselves. This nauseating realization caused a tightening sensation in my gut that nearly sent me into a vomiting fit. Fortunately I came to, as my strapping chair had not robbed me of my energy during the last 2 days. I had my wits about me in a way that reminded me of how I used to be in my youth, how I felt with Faye, how I could have been, had my life not been packaged into one of these boxes on a conveyor belt, opened and delivered to this parasitic heat to be consumed. Although I was slowed down by my stomach cramps, I made it back to my workstation. Slumped in my pod, I meditated on the meaning of the last 2 days' events. I am still trying to make sense of it all.